Well, it is good to be with you again this week as we continue our dive into the Ten Commandments, this week focusing on the third and fourth commandment. You know, as a kid, I had to memorize the Ten Commandments in the second grade before I made my first confession in the Roman Catholic Church. And like the first two, 3 and 4 spring out of allegiance to God. The third, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. And the fourth, remember that thou keep holy the Sabbath day. Now that third commandment was interpreted in so many ways that as a child, I worried that the souls of some of the people I loved were in mortal danger. As it appeared, they were violating the third commandment on a daily basis. At a young age, if you asked me God's last name, I might have said, damn it. So what exactly is the third commandment all about? Is it about swearing and profanity, or is it something larger? Well, the third commandment addresses the association of God's name, Yahweh, with false or disastrous purposes. And this was deeply connected to the significance attached to names in the ancient Near East culture. You see, names revealed the character of one's identity. And so there was a considerable relationship between one's name and one's reputation. And the power of the spoken word was also a strong belief in this culture. And so there was causal connections between words and events, which is where the concept of blessing and curses emerged from. Thus, to invoke the divine name was to associate the power and purposes of Yahweh with the thing being spoken and the purposes being represented. And so using God's name in vain involves associating God's purposes and powers that are inconsistent with God's identity and God's will. Using God's name in vain involves associating God's purposes and powers in ways that are inconsistent with God's identity and will. And so the end result is a misrepresentation of God, a false claim to divine power and endorsement, and a miscommunication of truth. Using God's name in vain is a manipulation of God. It's to harness divine power to serve human interests, and this temptation is always with us. Misuse of God's name is like having your identity stolen. The thought of someone being taken advantage of or hurt in my name on social media or through an internet scam, it really angers me. And I think this probably angers God as well, when God's identity is used for nefarious purposes. And so we're not to take God's name lightly. And I think all of us at one time or another are guilty of breaking this command in the ways we use God's name. The book of Numbers, in chapter 30, verse 2, lays it out in a very practical way. It says, when a person makes a solemn promise to Yahweh or swears a pledge of binding obligation for themselves, they cannot break their word. You must do everything you said. And think about it. Marriage vows, oaths of office, promise-keeping, and truth-telling are ways that we use God's name. I swear to God, so help me God. In the name of God, do you take this person to be your spouse? And so misusing God's name in this sense is about not living up to the commitments that we have made in our relationships with others and with God. And sadly, this concept seems to be lost these days. But perhaps the phrase, my word is my bond, needs to be reintroduced, especially in a time when truth is hard to come by and promises are easily broken. something of which we are all too familiar, because all you have to do is open a newspaper or listen to the news to witness these phenomena. Sadly, we've gotten used to it. And Jesus doubles down on this in his Sermon on the Mount when he reminds us to positively hallow God's name in our words, and especially in our actions. He says, "Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made.' But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one." You know, friends, we're created in God's image, and we're meant to reflect God's image to one another. And we bear God's image in our words and actions each and every day, and they represent or misrepresent the God who created us and the God who loves us. And so the depth and breadth of this commandment to not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain goes well beyond using the name of God as a figure of speech, "Oh my God," or an expletive. Goes beyond the bumper stickers we place on our cars, beyond the crosses we wear and the oaths and promises we make. Jesus said, "As my followers, you represent me. And just as I came to bring light to the world, that light lives in you. So use it that you might be drawn to and not repelled by God because of you. Keep my name holy in your thoughts, words, and deeds, and remember to whom you belong and represent." And I think this leads to God's fourth commandment that was given to the people of Israel to reinforce their identity. You know, I think the fourth commandment, remember to keep holy the Lord's Day or the Sabbath, is best understood by considering the meaning of the root word of Sabbath, Sabbat, which simply means to rest. And so that commandment could be translated to mean, remember the rest day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a rest day to the Lord your God. And the version of this commandment found in Exodus anchors it to the creation story and to a loving God who delivered the Jewish people from the bondage of slavery to create this covenant community. And Sabbath or rest, contextualized by the words remember and holy, was part of the identity and a sign of God's covenant and promise to the Jewish people. And so Sabbath keeping, a time of rest devoted to refreshment and remembering the Creator, set the Jewish people apart from the surrounding culture. Sabbath was life-giving. This seventh day reflected God's care and concern in a world that operated and relied 7 days a week on the labor of the most vulnerable. God recognized the innate need for rest, recreation, and renewal. He recognized that we need it for human flourishing. And it was and remains a gift from God for everyone. You know, I found it surprising as I was preparing for this sermon tonight that one of the early penalties for violating this commandment was actually death. And Adam Hamilton, in his book, Words of Life, Adam is a United Methodist pastor and probably the largest Methodist church in the United States. He wondered if the death penalty was actually a metaphor, a way of pointing to the impact of not resting. He says if you're unwilling to stop and rest, your health will deteriorate, your relationships will suffer, and in 1,000 other ways you will pay the price. If you die of a heart attack at age 55, because you seldom took time to rest and reduce your stress, or end up divorced because you never made time to rest, renew, and play with your family? Was it worth it? Failing to observe Sabbath results in a death penalty for each of us. Exhaustion coupled with the loss of joy, of relationships, of gratitude, and so many things that are meant to enrich our lives. You know, when my children were younger, they had a teddy bear hamster. In Teddy's cage was a wheel that he used to run on for hours and hours and hours each day. And I don't know what it was that compelled Teddy to keep running. But I know that there have been times that I have felt like I am on that wheel, and I imagine you have too. Life does not start that way, but sometimes it becomes this, especially when I say yes too often to things which are good, but not necessarily the best use of my time, and a hard time saying no, which results in overcommitment. And if you've experienced this like me, regular Sabbath keeping can be an antidote. You know, we should work hard and give it our best 6 days a week, because meaning and purpose lead to joy, and that's found in our work. But one day in 7, we were meant to get off the hamster wheel. And as I think about what Jesus might say to us about Sabbath, I imagine these words: I long to give you rest, to see you recreate and be renewed. Sabbath is a gift, like all God's commandments that God gave to you, that is a part of a life well lived. Please don't exchange this gift for something of lesser value. God so longs for you to spend time in God's presence, to honor God with your prayers and your worship. So remember this gift, treasure it, keep it holy, and you will be deeply blessed. Friends, these commandments point us towards God, who uttered first these words and how we are meant to live our lives in the midst of our deepest struggles. These 10 teachings are not ours to possess. Instead, they claim us as God's beloved, set apart by word and deed for the healing of God's holy world.